Joan of Arc. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Terrified an Army. Imagine standing on a battlefield in medieval France. Smoke fills the air. Thousands of soldiers are preparing for another bloody confrontation. And then, through the chaos, a teenage girl appears. She isn't a seasoned warrior. She isn't a powerful noblewoman. She isn't even 20 years old. She's 19. Yet, soldiers begin following her. Within months, this young woman will become one of the most famous figures in French history. Her name is Joan of Arc. But how did a teenage peasant girl become a symbol powerful enough to change the course of a war? And why did her enemies become so determined to destroy her? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Chapter 2. A Girl from Nowhere. Joan was born around 1412 in Domremy, a small village in northeastern France. She grew up during one of the darkest periods of the 100 Years' War. France was divided. The English controlled large parts of French territory, while their allies and supporters controlled other regions. The French crown itself was in crisis. For ordinary people, war wasn't something they read about. It was something they experienced. Armies moved through the countryside. Villages could be attacked. Food could disappear. People could lose their homes. Joan was not born into a royal family. She wasn't trained as a military commander. She was simply a village girl growing up in a country torn apart by war. Chapter 3. The Voices. But according to Joan's later testimony, something extraordinary began happening when she was around 13. She began hearing what she believed were heavenly voices. She later identified these voices as belonging to saints. At first, she was told to live faithfully, but eventually, the message became more specific. She was told to help France. And Joan believed she had been given a mission. She was supposed to help the French heir, Charles, reclaim his kingdom. To most people, this could have sounded impossible. A teenage peasant girl was claiming that she had been chosen to save France. But Joan refused to give up. Chapter 4. The Journey. Eventually, Joan managed to reach supporters of Charles, and somehow, the impossible began to happen. She was taken seriously. The French leadership agreed to allow her to accompany the army. She wasn't simply sent home. Instead, Joan entered a world dominated by soldiers, nobles, weapons, and political intrigue. And this was where her legend began. Chapter 5. The Symbol. Joan did not suddenly become a superhuman warrior. Her greatest influence came from something else. She became a symbol. To soldiers who had spent years watching France lose ground, Joan represented something they desperately needed: hope. She carried a banner, she wore armor, and she spoke with extraordinary confidence. She believed that France could win, and soldiers began believing it too. Chapter 6. The Siege of Orleans. In 1429, Joan arrived during the Siege of Orleans. The city was strategically important. If Orleans fell, the French position could become even more desperate. The situation was dangerous, but Joan pushed for action. French forces launched attacks against English positions, and eventually, the siege was lifted. Joan's reputation exploded. The teenage girl from Domremy was no longer an obscure peasant. She had become a military symbol. More victories followed. The French army moved towards Reims, and eventually Charles was crowned King Charles VII. Joan had helped accomplish the mission she believed she had been given, but her story was far from over. Chapter 7. The Capture. Joan continued fighting, but the political situation around her was becoming increasingly complicated. French factions disagreed about how aggressively they should continue the war. Joan wanted to keep fighting. Eventually, she was captured by Burgundian forces, allies of the English. She was sold to the English, And then came the part of the story that would ultimately define her legacy, her trial. Chapter 8. The Trial. Joan was put on trial for heresy. The proceedings were heavily political. She was questioned repeatedly. Her clothing, her visions, her behavior, and her religious beliefs were all examined. The trial lasted for months. Joan was young. She was surrounded by powerful men who wanted her condemned. But throughout the proceedings, she repeatedly defended herself. Eventually, she was convicted. She was sentenced to death. Joan was 19. Chapter 9. The Fire. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was taken to the marketplace in Rouen. A crowd gathered. She was tied to a stake, and the teenage girl who had once ridden alongside soldiers now stood alone. The fire was lit. Joan of Arc died that day. She was only 19 years old, but death did not end her story. In fact, it transformed it. Chapter 10. The Reversal and Legacy. Years later, the political situation changed. A new investigation was ordered. The original trial was examined, and in 1456, Joan's conviction was overturned. She was declared innocent. The girl who had been condemned as a heretic was now remembered as a heroine. Centuries passed. Her legend grew. Joan became a national symbol of France. Eventually, she was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church in 1920. But perhaps the most remarkable part of Joan's story isn't simply that she became famous. It's that she began as someone almost nobody would have expected to change history. She wasn't a king. She wasn't born into wealth. She wasn't a famous general. She was a teenager from a small village. And yet, for a brief moment, in the middle of a devastating war, thousands of people believed that this young woman could lead them toward victory. Whether you believe Joan truly heard divine voices or interpret her story through another lens, one thing is difficult to deny. She changed history. And perhaps that's why nearly 600 years after her death, people are still asking the same question. How did a 19-year-old girl convince an entire nation to believe again? This is the mystery of Joan of Arc, and it is one of the reasons her story has never disappeared.